Marissa. So as Marissa said, my name is Emily Merchant, and I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University in the plant biology and pathology department. And I have a concentration in medicinal plants. And my research also crosses into public health and nutrition. So a bit of a couple different hats that I wear. As Marissa said, a lot of my work has been focused in Kenya and specifically Nairobi. So I work out in Western Kenya, and then I work in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. But I have started projects in the New Brunswick Highland Park area. So if anyone is interested and wants to hear more about this type of work and research and maybe some of the things that are going on in the United States, my email address is down here below, so always feel free to reach out. But today I'll be talking about my work in Nairobi. So just a little bit of context. Nairobi is the capital of Kenya, and Kenya is a sub-Saharan East African country. So you can see it right here in this circle, and it's on the coast of the Indian Ocean. This means that Kenya was part of a lot of early trade routes between India and Asia, which we'll get to in a little bit. For a little bit more context too, some historical governance. So in 1884, Great Britain laid claim to Kenya and what is currently Kenya and Uganda. In 1920, Kenya colony was formed. In 1963, Kenya becomes part of the sovereign state, but is still part of the Commonwealth. So it becomes a sovereign state, but it's still part of the Commonwealth. This means that the Queen still ruled over Kenya, the Queen of Great Britain, but Kenya is in a sense considered like an independent. But Kenya becomes a fully independent republic with its first president in 1964. Kenya is then ruled by a one-party system for the next, whatever this is, like 40-ish years until the first multi-party election. And so that's been probably the past 18 years that Kenya has had a multi-party system. So if you really look at this history here, this is almost 80 years that Kenya is under a colonial rule, and then another 40 years that it's ruled by a one-party system. So here I mentioned those trade routes that Kenya was a part of. So we see India and Persia, Arabia, China, and into Kenya, and all of these different trade routes. So there is cultural heritage and genetic markers from China and India in Kenya for quite a ways back, pretty historically. The population of Kenya is about 45 million people. For context, the United States is 328 million, so it's much smaller than the United States. And then jumping back over to the cultural heritage, in Kenya, in addition to the cultural influence of other countries like Great Britain, China, India, as suggested, Kenya also itself has 42 distinct cultural groups with their own languages and customs. So why do you think I shared all of that information? When you're thinking about food security issues and solutions to food security problems, how does that historical context change the way that you might think about all of this?
You guys can unmute yourself or put in the chat box. Why is historical context important when working in a community or when helping them address their needs or identifying community issues? Any ideas?
I think it's oh sorry. This is Christina speaking.
Thank you.
I think it's important because when you think about European nations, they were kind of like part of the old world and everything, and so them bringing new colonization over to a place like Africa where it's a little bit farther away does tie into kind of how their society was built and what like that laid the foundation for who they are today. And one thing about their culture is having 42 distinct different groups with different languages and different cultures makes it hard to, find a common language and find a common ground to help tackle the issue of food security. Because I know if you spoke a different language and I spoke a different language, but I didn't speak your language, it causes a little bit of a problem. And cultural differences, you eat different foods, you like different things, you grow different crops. So with that kind of, and then the trade and its location next to China, next to India, and they have all these different spices and crops going into Kenya, it all affects kind of like the food insecurity within the nation.
Yeah, that was wonderful. If anyone else has anything to add, please interrupt me or write it in the chat box. But I think, Christina, you really hit it on the head. In a sense, it's just very complicated. There are, with the 42 different cultures and the different languages, and like you suggested, the different food preferences, also in part due to region. So if we back up to this slide, you can see that Kenya is below the Saharan desert, right? So we are in a fairly lush, and you can kind of see in here this like little blue, this is Lake Victoria. So there are regions that fish is the more popular food, other regions where chicken, kind of depending on where you are geographically. But yeah, it just means that it's very, very complicated, and there's a lot of layers to this onion to peel back when you're trying to understand the decisions that households make in terms of their food consumption. One of the things that is continuing to make this situation even more complex is urbanization. And so in 2008 was this like watershed year in the idea that the number of people in the world living in urban populations became larger than the number of people living in rural populations. This is even more true for sub-Saharan Africa. The urbanization has increased even more dramatically. And the infrastructure in these urban areas cannot keep up with the number of people living in the urban areas. And that results in informal settlements being created. So where I work in Nairobi, I don't really work in Nairobi. I actually work in Kibera, which is the largest informal settlement within Nairobi. About 60% of Nairobi's citizens live within a slum. So not necessarily Kibera, there's actually 3 in Nairobi, but Kibera is the largest. And you can kind of see from this picture some of it. So it's, you know, what categorizes an informal settlement is that there's no land tenure, so you don't own your home, you rent. There's really no government rules within an informal settlement, so there may be tribal leaders or gang leaders depending on where you are regionally, right? Because there's informal settlements in other countries too, and so in Kenya they tend to be tribal leaders relating back to those 42 different cultural groups that are identified in Kenya. But so yeah, so there's like informal governance, there's no land tenure, lack of secure access to water or electricity. Houses tend to be built out of materials that you can kind of just find. So they're really, it's really fragile is a good word. When I was there a few years ago, a fire actually broke out and it just took out everything. And within days, it was almost rebuilt, because that's how fragile, but also how quickly people can mobilize to get things done, because they're built out of materials that are kind of just located around. So in what ways, so I kind of just touched on this a little bit, but I like hearing people's voices, so I add questions. In what ways do you think urbanization may affect food security?
Open to anybody. Let's hear from Louisa or Emma. Christina, Leo, any ideas? Anne, Estella. Oh, Anne said it might affect which areas need more food than others.
Yeah, absolutely. In urban areas, you can definitely see like wealth discrepancies. So areas of poverty, like the informal settlements, versus areas of wealth, which has resource allocations. But in the way that we are starting to understand it, so it's that insecure land tenure and that inadequate infrastructure, as well as barriers to accessing water, sanitation, nutritious food, and adequate healthcare that often lead to these high rates of food insecurity. I also just made everybody go away, so there we go, I can find everybody again. Can someone define for me so we're talking about food security, and we're talking about the World Food Prize, but can someone define for me what food security means and maybe an idea of why it matters?
Great question. Leo, it looks like you have an answer.
Food security, I think, is if you are in a place that is, or no, if you are in a state of poverty, you have enough food to survive. And if there is something like what's it called? There's something like a natural disaster or a storm, you have enough food, like saved, or you have the availability, or you have the ability to have enough food or get food.
Okay, so there's quantity, so you have enough food. What do you think is there any other elements of food that we are maybe important to food security?
The nutritional value of it. So you don't have to give as much. You can give less of the higher calorie food.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so food security is really talking about both access to quality and quantity of foods. And so you may have a lot of different quantities of foods, but they, as you said, Leo, they may be all very high calorically dense. They may not be very nutritious. And so you may feel satiated. You may, to a casual observer, look food secure, right? You might not look famine, but you may have micronutrient deficiencies because you're not eating the quality of foods that are necessary.
Oh, and just, I think Estella, she put a perfect definition that sums all of that up in the chat box. She said, food security is the availability, quality, and quantity of food to feed your family and yourself.
That's perfect. Yeah. And it's really wonderful. Some definitions of food security are being expanded, particularly when you're in this context, to even then bring in the idea of preferred foods. So is it not just access and quality and quantity of food, but it's adding that word preferred in front of food. So are you eating foods that are culturally preferred by you? Which is really interesting when you're thinking of it in the context of the United States with people who are emigrating here from other countries. Do they have access to their preferred foods? And this matters because we have because malnutrition, so not reaching those different things, can cause health effects such as stunting or wasting or obesity. And we still see in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa very high rates of malnutrition. I think this is stunting, yeah. So this is of stunting. And while in a lot of countries over the past, decade or so, we've started to see rates of different forms of malnutrition, so this is stunting, which is just one form of it, decrease, we're actually in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia seeing a continued increase. And so these problems are persisting in these countries and they need our attention. Okay, so urban agriculture, and so I'm not going to ask this question because I think for the sake of time we'll move on, but just something to ponder. So urban agriculture may offer partial solutions to food security. And when we think about that, there are just a couple of ways that we can categorize urban agriculture. So urban agriculture can be these transformed green spaces, so like an edible schoolyard or backyard garden, or they could be integrated into the infrastructure of buildings like a rooftop agriculture or a vertical farm, hydro or aquaponics. And so I work with, when we're in Nairobi, I work with a form of vertical farming. It's not very vertical. I mean, it's vertical, but modestly so. But it's called sack gardening. And so these are like big grain sacks or bean sacks that get filled with a mixture of soil and compost. And then you plant leafy greens. So the preferred vegetables in Nairobi tend to be African nightshade, spider plant, and amaranth. So you plant them into the sides of the sack garden. And like I said, we work with nightshade, amaranth, spider plant, kales. All of these vegetables are considered African indigenous vegetables. And so when we go back to the idea of preferred foods, African indigenous vegetables tend to be preferred foods, but because of a lot of the slave trade and the colonial rule, and then the complexities of aid-based problem solving, right? So like foreign services just bringing money or crops or seeds, Western vegetables like cabbage have become pretty dominant in the landscape. And a lot of these indigenous vegetables have been lost. So we call them orphan crops, even though they are extremely nutrient dense, they're climate smart, so they can endure the droughts and pests of this region better than Western introduced plants can. And because they're preferred, but they're often not grown, they're considered to have this income generation for households who are farmers, to meet this unmet demand and to generate another revenue stream. So for the program that I'm talking about specifically today, we trained a group of women from a women's empowerment program in Kibera over a 3-day period. And the training was done by our colleague from AMPATH, which is it's like a teaching extension hospital out in Western Kenya. And this 3-day training involved both indoor and outdoor components, and the women built sack gardens. So we had 32 participants, and they worked in teams of like 5 or 6 to build about 6 different sacks that we planted with different African indigenous vegetables. So looking at our demographic data a little bit, 45% of our women were married, but 75% of them were the head of household. This is very rare. In most married situations in Kenya, the men are the head of households. So this dynamic told us, and more questions with the women told us that in most of the cases, the husbands did not live in the households with the women. They lived in other places. So they may have lived in other places in Nairobi, or it's not uncommon for households to split and for one member of the household to remain back in the rural village while another member moves to the city. This was important information because it let us know that then the women in some cases may have more decision-making power than they would if they were in a more traditional household setting where the husbands and the wives live together. And 80% of our women worked in an informal job sector. And so from this context, they were already selling foods or selling jewelry or things that they made, kind of making money for themselves. They didn't have an employer.
Emily, I'm just going to give you a time warning for a couple minutes.
Okay.
I know we started late, but.
Okay, so when we think about some challenges, so we had some group size challenges where we had too many women to a sack and they weren't able to grow and harvest as much as they would like. And drought really played a big function in the success of the sack gardens. But we also did have some really great opportunities where the women were really motivated and they felt an increase of self-confidence being part of this program. And they wanted to continue training because they were interested in that income generation component, as well as having a preference for the vegetables. There was a lot of pride in the fact that they grew the vegetables themselves and they knew what went into the growing of those vegetables. Over the program period, we also saw an improvement in, so these are 2 different metrics for health. This is dietary diversity, so how diverse is your diet, and this is household hunger. So we saw an increase in dietary diversity and a decrease in household hunger. Yeah, that's it.
I have a question about the sacks. Do we know if the women or the families used all the food to eat for their families to eat, or do we know if there was enough for some of them to sell to then be able to buy other food?
That's a great question. So in some cases, the women on their own volition started more sacks. And if they started more sacks, then we saw that they were able to sell from the additional sacks that they started. So some women did report that they were able to sell produce and that alleviated, so that it was income generation. But what we saw that was also interesting was a lot of women saying that because they grew vegetables and they didn't have to buy vegetables, that alleviated household money that then they could spend on other foods as well. But there's a study that's cited in this slide. So there's a group, we're not new to introducing sack gardens to Nairobi and Kibera in any sense. So this study, they found that a minimum of 3 sacks was really necessary to both impact household economics and food security.
Interesting. Emily, there was one question about the sacks, if they're biodegradable.
No, unfortunately, these are not. I think these are like those, like an IKEA bag, that like kind of plasticky, tarpy type material. I think that these are mostly what these are made out of. Yeah.
Maybe it's a good thing though, so they have those as sources for many years and they stick around. So,
yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? If you have more questions for Emily, feel free to put them in the chat box. If anything comes up, maybe she'll hang on with us when Dr. Jacob Park is done. But otherwise, we're going to pass the mic to Dr. Jacob Park. He's coming from Castleton University in Vermont, the College of Business, and he specializes in social and environmental dimensions of innovation, entrepreneurship, and international business, with special interest and expertise in emerging economies in Asian Pacific, Africa, and the Caribbean regions. And I just want to, I put one thing in the chat box for you guys to consider. It's a screenshot of an image of questions as you're preparing research papers. Questions to think about when you're defining possible solutions that you come up with to address some of the topics and needs in the countries that you choose. So just keep those questions in mind. And also, as Dr. Jacob Park is going through his PowerPoint, try to think about it through that lens. So I will officially pass the mic.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Super. So I'm going to, well, thank you, everybody. This is a kind of good compliment. I didn't really know of Emily or her work until now. So is this a good kind of compliment, because she's having done a fair amount of work in Kenya and East Africa myself. It's sort of, her issues are, I can only imagine. Can I just ask you, Emily, where is the garden? Because there's really no land in Kibera. So where is the land in which the food is growing?
So we partnered with a school right on the
Okay.
outskirts of Kibera, where a lot of the parents, so it's a school for special needs kids, and a lot of the parents have children there. I think it's a relationship between the nonprofit we were working with and the school, that a lot of the parents already organically went there with their kids, and that gave us some land. But that also posed its own problems. So we're in a sense back in the drawing board trying to figure out another secure space so that we can really make this program bloom.
Right. So again, having been to Kibera in Kenya many times, I just looking at the pictures of the land. I was like, where is that? I've never seen it before. Anyway, so I'm going to take, it's a good compliment to what Emily's doing, because I'm going to try to look at this issue about providing food security solutions from very kind of large, kind of a global perspective, with some examples that can come. So really the question that I wanted to focus on is, why do we need new models of investment and finance to address the larger sustainable development? Because I think it's really important to put that in context. The second question I'm going to address is, what's the problem that with food security problems that we're trying to solve on a very kind of large global perspective? Clearly, examples that Emily gave, what's a problem and a solution in Kenya or within Nairobi or even Kibera, that's all going to be different. So geographically, all have to be situated. And then some ideas in terms of how we could accelerate different ideas of investment and finance models that are currently being designed and developed as we speak. Okay, so why do we need a new model to accelerating finance and money, basically? How do we fund these kind of things? And the problem is that we just simply don't have enough, right? So if you put together the question of I don't know if you had a module on sustainable development goals, these are the UN sort of goals started in 2015 that goes up to 2030, and annually there's a shortfall of approximately there's a $3 trillion shortfall every year between the money that we need, not just for food security, but things like for energy poverty issues, which I really work on as well in East Africa, as well as the other issues. So everything you can think of in terms of trying to improve the world, the international community, the world at large, there's a shortfall of about $3 trillion, which is only getting worse because of COVID, right? So now that there's economic turmoil and not enough people are working, particularly in places in developing countries, in Africa, what's ironic about in Africa is that they're actually doing quite well with COVID in terms of case numbers, but the economic fallout is actually devastating to a lot, because now it's such a huge economic kind of toll on it. So every program, every business is affected economically from it, although in terms of the case numbers, actually is not as bad as North America and Europe, ironically, but people fearing the worst. So one other sort of picture you want to get at is, how do we get to this current state, right? So if you go back, let's say 20, 25 years ago, right? How do we do development? Traditionally, it was you had an aid agency. In the United States, you had US Agency for International Development that get allocated money from Congress, and they were depending on what the topic is. I noticed that Emily got some of the money actually from USAID, and it funds research like what Emily's doing, which I would call community-based grassroots research, but they also fund big programs in terms of, so there's another agent, they also give, State Department also gives a chunk of money for things like humanitarian disasters and famine. So whenever you hear stories about, something going on, let's say in like Ethiopia right now, a lot of the money goes to the UN agency to do that. So traditionally, that's always been the case. About 20 years ago, they realized that the money for those allocations is simply not enough. There's a long story, I'm gonna try to keep it short. So they were really encouraged to engage with the private sector. That's like private food companies, seed companies, fertilizer companies, to get them to help in partnership with US governments and other governments to help alleviate things like food security and humanitarian issues. And now the issue moving forward between now and to the near forever future is to how to work with the private capital markets to realize that there's simply not enough resources. So ideas they're forming is, how can we tap things like bonds, stock, and other types of private sort of capital. Again, I realize that there's some of you are going to ask questions, what's a bond, what's a stock? And that I can't, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into any details about that. But understanding is that there used to be very separate bucket. There were food security issues, humanitarian issues was one bucket. And then sort of things that more traditional economic development work was done in another bucket. But now we need to integrate that, because it was simply, there's no way that funding will be enough. And critically, if you look at in terms of private capital flows, if you look at the bottom is basically, if you look at despite huge increases in humanitarian disasters, food security problems, the amount of money then dispersed from governments, that's US Agency for International Development, to Africa, South America, and Asia is flat. So the only money that you sort of see here is actually private capital that go into it. Now, that's good and bad. You could say, well, what's wrong with that? But it's not, you need to direct. The critical question is, how can we direct the private capital, which is increasing, toward divert them to sustainable development goals? Now, is that easy? No, I'll explain why it's not easy. But that's the only way, because if you rely on the bottom tier of traditional development assistance, we're never going to reach scale in order to address the problem. So it's not whether you think it's a good idea or not. You simply cannot. Same thing for within the United States. One of the reasons why that hunger is such a problem is that unless private sector actors are involved somehow in a good way, I'm not saying they always play such a positive role, they have to provide the resources, people, and money, more importantly, to solve the food security problems, not just in Africa or South America, but also in the United States as well. Okay, so what's the problem that we're trying to solve here with this unlocking private capital markets? Well, I'm going to sort of I'm going to send the slides to Marissa so she can sort of share that with you. And I pulled together, this was a report that was done there's a link there if you want to look at it in June 2020. And I thought that a very good job of kind of highlighting the problem that we're trying to identify. And from this report, I pulled together this so food systems and climate change is a good example of this, right? So food system, interestingly, contributes to climate change, but also climate change contributes to food systems. So if you look at it, and what makes this dynamic between climate change and food systems so critical is because climate change will decrease food production, while food system actually act as an agent driving deforestation. In cases like Brazil, as an example, where you really cannot think about deforestation or doing the Brazilian sort of the fires that you sort of see in Brazil, unless you really deal with the cattle industry there. And that actually is what support the beef industry and its exports from Brazil to the rest of the world, including the United States. So basically, food systems is act as both impacted by climate change, but also contributes to climate change. So how do you unlock this, right? So one of the reports they put out is going beyond traditional finance mechanisms and really try to have 4 actions here, okay? I obviously don't have the time to go into details of this. So I encourage you to look at it when you're thinking about solutions for this. It's really realigning policy to link finance that support, not detract from, but support things like food innovation and social movements. So in other words, we always look toward governments for things like supporting social movements and innovation because that was the public good. But no longer, because the government, again, for many reasons, were not able to support by themselves. So basically you need government, what we call in kind of academic circle, cross-sector partnership to link with private sort of industry, with private capital, with the public good. It's a question mark. I'm not saying that this is easy to be done. So Action 4.2 talks about how you need to unlock billion sustainable finance. That's a whole talk in itself. So I would encourage you to go to the report and look under how this, and what you're looking for is integration of these kind of things, not divergence. So integrating how this traditional private capital works alongside food systems and food security. So how do we do this, okay? One interesting problem that is highlighted, and this is a recent report, came out of the Nature Conservancy University of Chicago Institute, Paulson Institute, talks about the global biodiversity financing gap. So my argument here, as a solution, is that you cannot deal with the food security issue unless at the same time you deal with the biodiversity issue. They have to be interlinked, because what's causing the biodiversity shortfall is traditional agriculture, okay? And you countless examples, and that is what's driving all those environmental problems. So the argument has to be that you can't just try to compete for different buckets, right? So my argument is, and this is not just my argument, it's argument of many scientists, is only way you could do this is unlike funding for biodiversity and agriculture at the same time. And really, again, the gap for biodiversity funding is also very large, $711 billion every year, which they expect. And if I show you more time, I will share with you how these are kind of segmented. But the idea is there's simply not enough money. It doesn't really matter what you think or what I think. There's simply not enough money, just like we've seen with COVID, all the money to go places, right? So how do we unlock this? How do we make this more of a connection? So one idea, it's only one, is to make sure that traditional subsidies that harm the environment. So in other words, we spend more money on harmful agricultural subsidies. So if you think of the European Union as an example, right? Their actual policy is really good. But one area which they're not doing so well, they subsidize agriculture to the point where, and the reason why this is a problem is that it locks out exports that can come from, let's say, Kenya to Europe. Reason why they don't export as much is because there's subsidies, fishery and forestry. So that's a kind of a different issue, a policy question. But to me, there's a fundamental question for food security, because traditionally we're spending money on things that actually harm the agriculture and harm the environment. So how do we do that? Well, we can't subsidize it. I'm not saying this is easy. It's arguably the most political issue in almost every country I could think of. But subsidy is clearly something we need to address. The other issue is not just cut subsidies, but how do we funnel money into things that are actually going to protect biodiversity and protect enhanced food security. So this is one kind of a mutual fund. This is kind of like where your parents and many adults have the retirement money in traditional kind of stocks and bonds. So this is the fund that basically says that we're not going to just look at high growth companies, Googles of the world, Facebook of the world. We're actually going to try to support through financial support and development of early stage like companies that actually help biodiversity and increase food security. So it's almost like if you took Emily's idea about the sack gardens and turned it into a social enterprise, and it was able to attract funding, that's the one way the funding could actually be scaled, right, to do that. So instead of donating, which most people do, this is how legitimate is this? This is a November 2020 startup, right? With less than a month it's been around, right? But the entire capital market that goes to biodiversity and food security runs into billions of dollars. So the question is not whether or not there's adequate funding. There is adequate funding for things. How do we channel them through loans, sort of investments toward things that are helping food security, not hurting it? Now, it sounds like a simple dichotomy, right? Don't do bad things and do good things. But it's incredibly difficult politically to make this happen. But this simply, so things are happening. And my biggest concern is between now and 2030, when climate change is really coming to impact us, how can we do this fast enough? So that's the question, right? If you ask me, I'm always been an optimistic person. Do I think there's always going to be enough money for this? Yes, but do we have enough time? That's the question, right? That to me is a question. Next 10 or 15 years, can we really, steer the ship toward good capital and away from bad capital? So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Wow, Jacob, you give us a lot to think about. If anybody has questions, now's your time to unmute or put it in the chat box. But I just want to ask you, when you talked about kind of how the government subsidizes farming
Right.
and such kind of for the industrial, is that happening all around the world? Are governments in most
Every
countries
country.
subsidizing industrial ag?
Every country.
Seems kind of crazy. I mean, seems like
it's
the money is there.
If you look at, remember, no matter how bad the budget is, farming is a political support, is critical, whether we're talking about United States or France. It is like anytime when you see images in Paris, or there are tractors coming through. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, everyone has an empathy toward small family farmers, and I'm not saying this is what the support is, but the subsidies, majority of the subsidy, that whether it's in France or whether it's in the United States, goes to big, large farms, not the small kind of farms we see in Vermont, right?
Yeah.
So every year you could track it, right? How much money goes into where? So bigger the farm, bigger the production, bigger the subsidy, right? And you can see if scale is all you want, bad things happen to soil, right? So the kind of agriculture that Emily's talking about is just simply not scalable in the way that you see farms in Iowa or in parts of France and Germany. This is not unique to the United States. It's pretty much, in fact, some people joke the European Union is a one big, agriculture support mechanism. A majority of the money from the European budget goes to subsidize agriculture, which many people don't realize.
Yeah, I mean, it boggles my mind, like the whole concept that we're subsidizing agriculture that's degrading the environment. It just doesn't seem sustainable, when we can pool our money in different places. So I really appreciate your presentation. And for all the teens on here, what Dr. Jacob Park presented and what Emily presented is kind of like what you're going to be doing. You're going to be thinking about a solution for a problem that you identified in your country. Something like how Emily presented her solution. Their solution is getting the community involved to grow in these bags. And they're not only bringing in the quality and the quantity food, but they're also bringing in culturally relevant food and training people. But the question really after that you're all going to be asked once you present your idea and your great solutions, how are you going to pay for it? We all have great ideas, but how do we pay for it? And that's very important. And that's really that answering that question of how it's going to be paid for and how it's going to be sustainable is kind of the sustainability of fixing our food system in the future. We need to know where the money's coming from. So it looks like Massimo has a question. So Massimo, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi.
My question was, how do you triage the different types of capital, that being public and private capital? And do you prioritize fixing the existing agriculture and architecture systems for food, or do you instead focus on R&D and research and development for climate change mechanisms? Like, how do you break the circle?
Well,
And would you rather use private capital or public capital for that?
so let me just take apart your excellent question, Massimo. The research and development piece of it, that can never really be privatized. And this is the problem that if you're wondering why does the richest country in the world in terms of economy have the healthcare system that we have, because we're trying to fit, right? We're trying to make something that really only work in a public-private space, make it all through one lens, right? And so the agriculture piece, if you leave it up to the private sector to fund, let's say, climate resilient seeds, for instance, that's not going to happen because there's no money in it, right? So this is where what we call blended capital, between pooling different private money and public money. So public money is best for doing things like supporting school lunch programs, right? That cannot be left up to the private capital, private market to do, because what is the interest in doing that, right? So there are for certain kind of public goods, it has to be public money, taxpayers' money. I don't see any other way for doing it. Now, for other things, for instance, right? So I'll give you one example of how could work, right? So if you asked me 20 years ago, what is a possibility that you're going to have fast food chains that caters to organic food, even vegan food in the US? There are competing vegan food chains in the United States. This is pre-COVID now, because who knows what's happened with COVID, right? Now, if you asked me that even 10 years ago, I would have said, no. Americans do not do vegan. Okay, they're simply not. Although my wife is, and both my son was a high school senior and my wife were both vegetarians, I never thought for a second that was even possible. Now we have competing restaurant chains to do that. Panera just released a policy on doing things like where they do a climate-friendly menu where they look at all the different food items, and you go to panera.com to look at this, right? Now, if you ask me, is that enough? That's also the private market doing it. So for certain things, it's all driven by what all of us want. If we want climate-friendly menus, then there will be companies that Panera will try to feed that. There's no amount of government campaign that's going to work because it would seem you're politicizing it. Some people argue to do that. I don't. So you cannot mandate certain things, as we know about masks and all that. You're going to force people to rebel. But if you leave it up to certain types of things, let's say healthy, climate resilient food systems, I'm convinced there is a retail food market space, entrepreneurship otherwise could feed that. But what you cannot do is try to have a private solution to a purely public problem, let's say hungry kids in schools. That's not going to really work. You can get donations, but in order to really work in the public interest, then you have to let the public sector, governments, let the schools kind of to do that. And I think a good example of this would be charter schools, right? There is a kind of a private component to it, but also but there's a public accountability. They can't just do whatever they want to do, right? Even if it's a religious school, they have to abide by state rules about educational standards, but you offer different models. And I think food systems could offer the same thing. So right now we're paying very heavy costs, as Michael Polino would say, very heavy costs for cheap food. And that has to stop. It can't be all about price, but sometimes it's more than that. And again, if you don't believe me, go to any food. What is the most number one thing that people want, like in food sort of pantries? It's like those cheap macaroni and cheese that are purple in color when you can do that. This is not healthy things, right? So people in need cannot be left to like whatever people donate. They deserve healthy food too. So I really think that there are there's a long way to answer your question, Massimo, but I really think there are certain public problems that deserve pure public solutions. But there are some other public problems that could be a mix of public and private. And there are other things like, let's say, retail food for fast food, that could actually, the private market could actually to scale that solution to things like, if, as I assume, people's palates are changing. I hope that was a long way to answer your question, but it was really to unpack that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's a very multifaceted answer.
Yeah, that's great. It blows my mind. I feel like just hearing both your presentations, it makes me think, like, God, we have so much work to do. But the good thing is the work is already began. Looks like all over the world. And all of you teens and anyone who's watching this from your schools, it's kind of in your lap. It's your job to take on kind of the next steps to push us forward. And maybe, as Dr. Jacob Park said, we're kind of racing the clock to some extent right now. So we need to take action now. There's no more waiting and thinking.
Just one point of thing I want to encourage you to look at how much sort of plant-based meat products have gone mainstream the last 5 years. I mean, Marissa and I
KFC,
know
don't they
it's
have a
certainly
KFC chicken?
beyond
Veggie
meat.
chicken?
Almost every fast food chain now has kind of plant-based meat. I'm not saying that's the solution, but if you asked me
Yeah.
5 years ago, I wouldn't think that's impossible. Burger King's never going to offer a plant-based meat-based Whopper, right? That would have
Yeah.
been a joke on Saturday Night Live, right? But it is now happening. Now, question is it happening fast enough, right, to address it? And I think that's kind of question that solutions that you should think about is not just scale, but speed, right? How do you integrate scale and speed together? And I would really encourage you to think about things do change. Americans are able to change, but are we able to change fast enough? That's the question.
Oof, the pressure's on.
All right.
Okay, everybody, is there any final question that takes 30 seconds to answer? Any final short questions or comments? Christina, anybody? Okay. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters for being here and sharing your
Yay.
knowledge and your research. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Marissa. And by the way, all you're doing is great work, and I just want to encourage all of you to continue the great work you're doing. And I'd love to see your research as well. Whenever you could, are you done with the field work, Emily, or do you need to go back for any reason?
It's a continuing project, but COVID has definitely had us reshift.
Yeah.
So now we're doing surveys with a lot of our program participants to understand how COVID has affected food security.
Well,
yeah.
I hope you continue your important work.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
Well, we'd love to have you back as judges when the kids
All
present
right. I would
their
love to
work.
do that. Okay. And Marissa,
It's
I'll
in
send you the
March.
slides so you have the reference and all that.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. And we'll post the slides. And I guess Serafina just texted me. Is it okay for you if we post this recording on the website? We have the kids'
Oh, that's fine.
permission.
And then if anyone has a question, follow-up question, my email's on the slide, so they could always email me.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you. You heard that, teens. You're always welcome to email Dr. Park and Miss Emily if you have questions about their
All right.
work.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Everybody else, we'll see you. We have 2 more sessions left. We'd love to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.